To begin assembly on this jig, the first thing you'll want to do is glue the 1-inch threaded rod into the rabbet in part CC and leave that to dry overnight. I'm using polyurethane construction adhesive for this, but epoxy would work just as well. While that's drying, I started to put together the base of the jig by clamping part A near the edge of my bench. Then I drilled pilot holes in part E for screws, spread on some glue, and screwed it in place. Next, I spread some glue on part D and got that clamped in place up tight against part E. Since 3/4 inch plywood is rarely 3/4 of an inch thick, part C needs to be adjusted by cutting a small amount off. With part C cut to the right size, it can be glued in place up tight against part D. The deck support blocks G1 to G4 are glued and clamped in next, and I let those dry fully before starting the next step. Part B is glued and clamped in place, and once again I'll let the glue dry thoroughly on this part before doing the next step. After the glue is dried, a quick sanding flattens and smooths the joint. It's a good idea to trim a little off the thickness of part DD so that it will slide freely in the jig. With part DD temporarily in place, I folded pieces of paper to shim up part F. To fasten part F, I drilled pilot holes, spread glue thinly to avoid a lot of squeeze out, and screwed it in place on top of the paper shims. Before the glue set, I pushed part D out and the paper shims with it. I added a clamp in the middle and set it aside to dry. The base of the jig is now complete. Next, I gave the entire base of the jig 2 coats of polyurethane. When that was dry, I checked to make sure that part DD still fit properly in the slot. With the base done, it's time to start assembling the carriage. Part CC goes up tight against part F, and I use tape to hold it in place and keep it from moving. With the glue spread on part CC, I clamped part BB down tight to it, making sure that it was perfectly flush with the face of part F. Then I could clamp on part AA, drill pilot holes, spread some glue on the joint, and screw it together. It's a good idea to check after each step to verify that the carriage still slides easily and make any adjustments before continuing. Next, I'll slide part DD back into the slot and put the rest of the carriage in place on top of it. I need to drill pilot holes that are the right depth and dry the screws. I'm not using any glue on this part. Again, I need to check the action, and mine is a bit too tight, so I backed off the screws and used paper to shim part DD. Checking it again, and it feels a lot better. Next, the side fence is fastened to part AA with glue and screws. Before the glue sets, it's important to check to make sure that it's square to the face of the fence. The carriage is now finished, and I coated all of the outside surfaces with polyurethane to seal it. I lubricated the parts that mate with the base with Vaseline to make it slide smoothly back and forth. With the 2 major assemblies out of the way, it's time to work on the parts that make the jig function, starting with the locking bar. These parts are made from solid hardwood. For mine, I'm using maple, but any kind of dense hardwood will do. The plans have all the details on how to make these parts, but I thought I would include some here just to show that they are very easy to construct with fairly common tools. Depending on how thick the washer is that screws into the locking bar, It may have to be sharpened slightly to better fit in the threads. The advance lever is the only part on the jig that will get worn and may have to be replaced after a few thousand box joints. But again, this part is also very easy to make. The lever pivots on a 2-inch panhead wood screw that's driven in most of the way to allow the lever to move back and forth easily. The wing that the return spring presses against is the offcut from cutting the point on the lever itself. It's a good idea to get some glue under the end of the locking bar so that it won't work loose over time. Lining up the locking bar is easy. Just move the carriage to the start position, push the bar into the threaded rod until the washer seats into the thread, and tighten the other screw. Swing it back out to clear the rod and tighten the second screw. Next, a small stop cam can be screwed in place and adjusted so that the advance lever slips straight into the thread. I found that the best thickness for the return spring is a little bit less than 1/16 of an inch, at least for maple. After it's been glued to the spring block, it can be screwed in place on the jig. Last thing is to screw on the larger stop cam and adjust that for the amount of travel you want. Here's a better look at how the parts work to move the carriage and lock it in place. The jig is now finished but needs guide bars to fit into the miter slots on your saw. I'm just using more maple for this, cutting it to fit flush with the top of the saw. I'm using the fence on the table saw to line up and square the jig where it needs to be, and some 5-minute epoxy is mixed up to glue the guide bars to the bottom of the jig. The jig is then set in place on top of the guide bars and tight to the table saw fence. After about an hour, I could flip the jig over and drive in some screws to secure the guide bars. The jig is now finished and ready to use. I didn't waste any time trying it out. I put a 1/8 inch blade in the table saw, set the jig for a 1/4 inch of travel per click, and started cutting a 1/8 inch box joint into these pieces of maple. As you can see, a perfect fit the first time. If you would like to build this jig, detailed, easy to follow plans are available on my website, ibuildit.ca.